Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to MOS Live. Today we're talking with Museum of Science educators all about reptiles. My name is Emily, my pronouns are she, her, and I'll be keeping an eye out for all of your questions today. Thank you for those of you who are tuning in on Facebook or YouTube, but please note that we are not able to share your comments with our educators from those platforms. For everyone here on Zoom, just press the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. Don't forget to include your name and age if you'd like a shout out. If you'd like to see captions, you can click on the closed captions button at the bottom of your screen and select show captions. I would now like to invite our educators to come on screen, introduce themselves, and we'll get started.
Hello everyone, my name is Marcus. My pronouns are he, him, his. And my favorite reptile myth would be that a lot of people think that snakes are slimy, when in fact they have some of the smoothest scales. And if we think about it, it makes a lot of sense because almost all of their body is touching the ground. They need those smooth scales to ensure that they don't get caught on anything when they're moving around, whether it's just moving around to find shelter or especially when hunting for prey.
Hi everyone, my name is Matt. My pronouns are also he and him, and my favorite myth is also about snakes, specifically the types that are known as milk snakes. And the reason they got that name is because farmers would often see them coming out of barns and think, oh, those snakes must have been eating my cow's milk. Now anybody can imagine that probably a cow standing still while an animal with about 100 teeth in its mouth fastened onto the other, probably not going to work. And you can probably guess that they were usually after the mice. But it's still a fun myth and one that's passed down to us through their interesting name.
My name is Maida. My pronouns are she and her. And one of my favorite myths, just following the trend here, is also about snakes. And it's that snakes are always out to get us. When in reality, snakes, I know it's cliche, but really they're more afraid of us than we are of them. They would rather us leave them completely alone. They don't want anything to do with us. And they would rather just be by themselves, hanging out in somewhere dark and away from us.
All right, thank you all so much. To get us started, could you just describe to us what makes a reptile a reptile?
Yeah,
Go for it, Maida.
I can start with that. So there are a few characteristics that make a reptile a reptile. They have to be vertebrates, which means that they have a backbone, just like we do. They have to have scales. They are ectothermic, meaning that they cannot produce their own body heat, and usually are born from eggs. That's the word. Am I missing any? You breathe air with lungs, you know.
Yep, that's it.
Probably the one thing they have in common as a group, universally, that makes them separate from other animals, because there are other groups of vertebrates, there's other groups of animals that breathe with lungs. But the thing that's so distinct about reptiles is their skin, which is usually very thick and filled with a very, very tough layer of keratin, which gives them their scaly appearance. And that's actually something that's allowed them as a group to live in places that many other animals can't.
Thank you. Zachary, age 7, is asking, do any reptiles live in the water?
I'll start with that one. If you folks want to add on, please do, because there are a lot of reptiles that live in water. Now, most of them do live on land because one of the things that makes an animal a reptile is the fact that they breathe air. There aren't reptiles that can only breathe underwater, but there are a few cool ways in which some reptiles can, and we can get into that a little bit later. But off the top of my head, some reptiles that might spend most of their lives in water include sea turtles. They have those characteristic scales, they have backbones, they breathe air, and they hatch from eggs. But they spend most of their life in the water. And you can see that based on some of the adaptations that they have. Especially sea turtles, they have flippers more than fingers or arms that help them crawl on land. And they're very, very well suited to swimming for a very long time. And they get all of their food, all of their energy from the ocean. In fact, males are thought to spend their entire life in the ocean, whereas females will only go on land to lay their eggs.
I'll add a little bit to that. There's also crocodiles that spend a fair bit of their time in their ocean and have a special way of getting salt out of their bodies that would otherwise damage their insides. There's kinds of lizards that at least go in and out of the water frequently, ocean water. And there's actually quite a few kinds of snakes that are sea snakes. Here's a photograph of one kind. These are two women getting very bravely close to photograph them because they do tend to be some of the more venomous snakes in the world. And as Marcus was mentioning, animals that spend all their time in the water have special adaptations. One of the things I'd like to point out here is the flattened tail of this sea snake that allows it to function as a paddle much better than the tails of most snakes.
Thank you. And I think you talked about it a little bit, but we have just a specific question here asking, are fish reptiles?
That's a wonderful question because we did say that one of the defining characteristics of a reptile are scales, and yet fish also have scales, but no, fish are not reptiles, although, you know, if that was the only defining characteristic, for sure they might be considered reptiles. But the other thing is that reptiles breathe air with lungs, and fish use gills to breathe.
And just something a little more specific with the scales is the area or the part of the skin where scales grow out of for reptiles tends to be closer to the top, whereas for fish, or a lot of fish, their scales tend to grow from the closer layer of skin, closer to the muscle and the bone. And so while they're both called scales, they're slightly different in anatomy.
They're also made of different things. I actually don't remember off the top of my head what most fish scales are made of. Sharks and rays actually have bony scales called dentricles that coat them. Whatever traditional fish are, I don't believe it's keratin. And the key thing is they're outgrowths of the skin, whereas reptile scales tend to be an actual part of the skin, a layer, even if that layer does overlap a little bit. And that's one of the reasons they can survive places nowhere else can, because that thick, scaly skin not only offers protection, but it also keeps water from getting out of the animal quite as easily.
Thank you. Okay, so we talked about if any reptiles can be in the water. Oliver, age 4, is asking, can any reptiles fly?
Oh my God, I love this question. Can I take it? So there are no flying reptiles that actually fly with wings like you would think of birds and bats and insects, but there are some snakes that are paradise flying snakes that, while they can't exactly fly like a bird, they can glide kind of like a flying squirrel. And so they leap off of really tall trees, and they usually are found in tropical rainforests. And they leap off of them and can fly. They can glide up to 100 feet, and some of the really good ones can even turn mid-air. So while they can't exactly fly, they are really cool and can still be above you and just completely zooming by, and that's just so cool to me.
Thank you. And a question here from Brannon, age 9, are reptiles cold-blooded?
I can broach that. That's the classic way we describe reptiles, even to this day. I mean, most books that you find that are new will use that as a term. It's a little bit more complex than that for a couple of reasons. What cold-blooded really means is that other different from animals like us, mammals and birds, that use a lot of energy from their food to maintain their body temperature at about an approximate place. Reptiles don't do that. They basically absorb the heat they need from wherever they're living, from the sunlight or from warm water or from a nice warm rock. And that has some advantages and some disadvantages. The advantage is they don't need as much food, but the disadvantage is that they can suddenly heat up or cool down to a dangerous degree unless they control that by going someplace cooler if they're too hot or going someplace warmer if they're too cool. We don't usually have to worry about that quite so much. Now, that being said, the terms we typically say are that you're ectothermic if you get most of your heat from the outside, and endothermic if you get most of your heat from the inside by generating with food. But even some ectothermic animals won't vary that much in temperature because they might have enough body mass to retain that heat, or they might just live someplace that's warm enough consistently that they stayed about the same temperature all the time. So it's a great question with a kind of complicated answer, but it's one of the things that makes reptiles so interesting.
Just to give an example example of what Matt was talking about how some animals' body temperature tends to remain the same, even though they're considered ectothermic, would be the leatherback sea turtle. That animal is one of the largest reptiles, and its body mass is so high that it can actually conserve heat very, very well. But there are recent studies that show that they have specialized nerve and muscle bundles in parts of their body which actually generate heat. And so that's when we start to get into the confused definition of, or the confused generalization that all reptiles are cold-blooded. In biology, there are always exceptions, and reptiles are no exception to that rule.
Thank you. And just to once again reiterate, Gwen, age 9, is asking, are turtles reptiles or fish? So can you talk a little bit more about turtles?
Sure. I'll just continue on. So a lot of turtles that we might think of, especially the ones that we've been talking about in this panel, tend to be sea turtles, but a lot of turtles and what we might call tortoises live on land. And although their skin might seem soft and they have that really hard outer shell, their scales are actually that shell. Their skin is soft, and for many of those turtles or tortoises, their skin doesn't have many scales over it, but their shell is considered to be formed by a lot of scales. And those are very specialized scales called scutes, and there are about 13 on top, and you can actually see the individual sections. They are indeed reptiles and not fish because they have those specialized scales. They tend to be ectothermic. We just stated one of those exceptions. They breathe air through their lungs, and most hatch from eggs. Or rather, yeah, let's go with most hatch from eggs.
In fact, here's a photograph of a tortoise hatching from an egg. And while fish also hatch from eggs with its biology, a few exceptions, but one of the things about fish eggs is that fish eggs are very gelatinous. They have to be laid in water, and they have to stay in water because otherwise they would dry out. Not only does reptile skin allow an adult reptile to live places that would dry out a fish or a frog, but even the reptile babies have that protection with a tough leathery shell that protects them from drying out so they can be laid on land. And yes, it is cute.
Very cute. And we've talked about this a little bit, but Liz, age 11, is asking, do snakes only live in the desert? So can we talk a little bit about where reptiles live?
Yeah, so did you say snakes can only live in the desert?
Correct, they're asking, yes.
Right, yes. So some snakes definitely live in the desert, but like I said, the paradise flying snake is definitely a tropical snake. So many reptiles are found in most places, with the exceptions being the really, really, really cold places for the most part. But other than that, they can be found in most places. And usually they tend to be more in aquatic-ish areas like tropics and places like that, but there are those that can live in the desert, and the adaptations for a reptile to live in a desert are really, really interesting and really amazing. They find really great ways to make sure that they stay as moist as possible, and especially don't heat up as much, because like we said, most reptiles get their heat from the environment. They also don't want to overheat, which could be a problem for an animal who lives in the desert and might be exposed to the sun for a really long time.
Thank you. Jazul, age 12, is asking, are crocodiles the biggest reptiles in the world?
I will take that one. Thank you, Matt. So, are crocodiles the biggest reptile in the world? If you ask me, my answer would be yes. The largest reptile in the world, to me, would be the saltwater crocodile. This crocodile can get around a little over 20 feet long at extremes and weigh close to...
Just while you're talking.
Excellent. It can weigh over 2,000 pounds. Perfect, exactly. And so they can get enormous. However, there are other reptiles that get longer. For example, the snake that you see on the screen is the reticulated python, and at extreme lengths, that snake can get to the length of a school bus, 30 feet long. That's in very, very rare cases, but that happens sometimes today. So If we're asking for the longest reptile, it's reticulated python. But those are reptiles that have lived today. There have been reptiles on this earth for millions or hundreds of millions of years. And so we've had a lot of different reptiles, including marine reptiles, prehistoric ones like the Ichthyosaurus that you see on the screen right there. I'm not sure of the size of the Ichthyosaurus, but it seems like it was larger than the ones that we have today.
Yeah.
Actually, were you going to mention the hanging one? Go for it.
Oh, no. I was just going to say that there was a new study where they looked at some remains of Ichthyosaurus, and they believe that some of them could actually get as big as some whales, which would definitely make them bigger than the crocodile and python.
All right, I should have gone second because this isn't going to be quite as impressive now, but we have a fossil ichthyosaur hanging in the exhibit halls of the museum that you can come and check out for yourself. And it's probably more dolphin size than whale size, but it's still pretty cool.
Thank you. And since we're talking about prehistoric things, Adam asks, what is the oldest reptile? I think it could be interpreted a couple ways, so take it how you would like.
So the oldest reptiles are forms that don't live anymore. I mean, when they basically have tracked the evolution of reptiles over time, we know that there were ancestral reptiles, that popped up during the age of the dinosaurs that don't exist anymore. I want to say thecodonts. I mean, there were lots of them. And a lot of them,
Sorry, no, go ahead.
Okay. A lot of them had this kind of lizardy look to them, and they were kind of a, just this not quite reptile, not quite amphibian form. If you want to talk about the ones that are around today that have the longest lineage, you're really looking at the turtles. Turtles and date back to the Triassic, and they don't look like modern turtles. I mean, they've got tiny, tiny scutes. Scutes are the scales that Marcus mentioned, but still you can just begin to see that difference that having little bits of armor started to make in their skeletons, and sort of imagine that as they had children, where that armor, those spots got bigger and bigger and then fused together, they'd be better protected. So I think turtles are probably the example of the lineage that you can date back the farthest.
Just real quick, I'd like to add that one of the oldest reptiles that we know of is called Hylonomus. He's believed to be over 300 million years old, which would make him older than the dinosaurs. And like Matt was saying, very much looking similar to a lizard, although he is not considered a lizard. There's a lot of stuff in the skull that makes him different from lizards, but lizard looking, at least to us from an outside. And of course, that's an artist rendition. We have no idea what he actually looked like, but that is what they think he possibly looked like. And he's really old and really cool.
Awesome, thank you. And since you mentioned turtles again, we have a lot of turtle lovers out there today. Are turtles and tortoises born with their shells? From Maddie, age 9.
They are, yeah. I'll put that picture back up, I think, and you can actually see. Oops, except I've got a thing of a snake now, so that's no good. So let me quickly switch back to that. But yeah, they are born with their shells. Basically, a general thing about reptiles is they come out ready to live. There are very few reptiles that give any kind of parental care. Basically, if they're egg layers, the parents lay the eggs and then they leave. Like Marcus said, exceptions. Crocodilians will hover around a nest for a while and they'll also respond to cries for help. There are some snakes that can actually generate heat for their babies by shivering their muscles. But by and large, the babies have to be ready to survive the moment they come out of the shell. So in this photograph, you can just see the edges of some of the scutes right there.
Great, thank you. And both Bobby and Prisha, age 8, are asking, what is the most dangerous reptile?
Well, I can start with that. The most dangerous reptile can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. It could be the most venomous, which might be what you're going for, but I would just like to say that a saltwater crocodile, if you come near that, the chances of you surviving that encounter are not super great. So that would be my bet, especially if you're coming towards a crocodilian, towards that nest. Like Matt mentioned, crocodilians tend to be an exception in terms of that mothers do sometimes care for the young. So if you come across a crocodilian's nest, Good luck. You guys can take on the other interpretations if you would like.
I'll take one interpretation. I suppose in a given year, the reptile that causes the most fatalities in humans would be one that we're very familiar with, which would be the king cobra. And don't get me wrong, the snake is very long and they are quite venomous. But one of the reasons that so many people pass away because of the snake is simply because a lot of people share an environment and a habitat with this snake. And so when there's a venomous snake that shares a habitat with a person, they're bound to come into contact with each other at some point. We as humans, we have homes and we like to keep our homes nice and neat and warm. And that's a perfect environment for a lot of snakes. And snakes, because they're very slender, they can fit through a lot of small places and they can find their ways into the homes of people. Specifically, the king cobra tends to live in parts of India where it's very warm and people tend to have their doors open. So the snakes go in and the people might not even see the snake before it strikes in defense. A lot of times these snakes are not trying to hurt the person, rather they're just defending themselves. And it just so happens that the snake tends to be very, very venomous. And so that would result in this person getting sick. And in a lot of those areas, people don't have quick access to a hospital where they can deliver the antidote or the anti-venom that would save their lives. And so that's when you run into a lot of complications.
Great, thank you. Zachary, age 7, asks, what is the fastest reptile?
I will quickly take this one because this answer absolutely blew my mind. So we may have heard of some snakes moving very quickly. The black mamba in Africa is a very venomous snake that actually tends to be quite territorial and will actively chase some people. And they can slither, I suppose is the verb, at about 14 miles per hour. And that's as fast as someone can run. An average person, that's really fast. But the fastest reptile would be the bearded dragon. And the bearded dragon is a very common pet for a lot of people. Not that I recommend them as pets, but they can reach up to speeds of, I believe it's 40 kilometers per hour or 40 miles per hour in very short bursts. And what's very cool about that is normally this lizard is a four-legged lizard and they move around on 4 legs, but when they run, they stand up on 2 legs and they scurry very quickly in the opposite direction. And so they're not chasing anything, they're running away from a perceived threat. And that's when they get really, really fast.
Awesome.
And if we had a video of that, that'd be perfect right now.
That'd be wonderful, wouldn't it?
For next time, right? So I think just to send us off, we have some questions here just about friendly reptiles and things. So maybe if you all could just say what your favorite reptile is to send us off.
So I can start that if you, I'm sorry. I could start that. So my favorite reptile is one that I worked with before, and I also work with it at the Museum of Science, and it's the Western Hognose. There are so many amazing things about this snake. It has so many cool adaptations, especially the fact that it's, in my personal opinion, the most adorable snake. It's got a little pointed scale that makes it look like it's got a little pig's nose, and it looks super cute. But also the fact that when they are scared, they will actually, as their very last line of defense, will flip upside down and pretend that they are dead. They very much are not, but they will flip upside down, insist that they are dead. And if you try messing with them, they might even poop or throw up on you to make themselves really smell dead. And it's just so cool. They are like little actors, but as soon as that threat walks away, they'll turn right upside down and continue on their day as if nothing happened.
I'll go second. The favorite reptile, I'm going to go with like Mara, with the favorite reptile I've worked with, which are American alligators. They are just so cool in so many different ways. They're another lineage that's gone back very, very far. You can look at fossil crocodilian ancestors from the Triassic, and you can start to see that thing that makes them crocodilians. It's very cool. But I think one of the things I especially like about American alligators is they really indicate the difference that people can make in helping wildlife. American alligators were almost extinct in the United States in the latter part of the 1900s over hunting. There were a lot of habitat destruction, especially as more and more people moved into Florida. And the US government stepped in to make them endangered. And there were other efforts that provided alternative uses of alligators for example, meat and for skin. And all these efforts have been so successful that alligators in Florida are probably more common than they've ever been. So I always like that as kind of a hopeful story that, you know, we can make a difference in helping nature come back.
We mentioned one of my favorite reptiles already, which is the saltwater crocodile, but I have another favorite one, which would be the Komodo dragon, and they are the world's largest lizard. So they're not as large as crocodiles, but they can get about 9 feet long. They're venomous, which is really, really cool because we don't know of many lizards that are. And they're just a very impressive animal that is incredibly large for the small island that they live in Indonesia. And they are considered endangered, so they are protected on that island, which is great news, but that doesn't mean that they're not a force to be reckoned with. They are great predators, and they can eat some very large deer, and they can weigh up to about 200 pounds on a very full belly, which is crazy to think. So Komodo dragon would be my favorite reptile right now.
All right, thank you all so much for sharing. I'll now ask you to wave and say goodbye. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much. I know we have some unanswered questions, but we are out of time. So I'd just like to thank you all for being here today. And if you'd like to check out more programs, please visit www.mos.org/MOS@home, or you can follow us on social media. And if you've enjoyed today's presentation, please visit the website on screen to support MOS at Home. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to see you again next time.